I'll never forget the look on Carol Martinez's face when my brother Jake calmly reached into his jacket, pulled out his federal credentials, and explained that he'd been conducting financial surveillance on their treasurer for the past 3 months. The woman who'd spent 6 weeks calling me a criminal sympathizer for letting my suspicious brother visit my property just stood there in my driveway, mouth hanging open, while 2 county deputies realized they'd been used as pawns in what was about to become the biggest municipal corruption case our county had seen in decades. Jake didn't raise his voice. He just looked at Carol, then at the officers, and said in that quiet way of his, "You just interfered with an active federal investigation. I'm going to need everyone to step back while I make a call." But I'm getting ahead of myself. 3 years ago, when I bought the little ranch house on Sycamore Creek Road, I thought I'd found paradise. After 22 years of city noise, apartment neighbors, and the constant hum of traffic, I wanted space, real space. The kind where you can sit on your back porch at dawn with coffee and hear nothing but birds and the creek running over the stones. The house itself was nothing fancy, a 1960s ranch with good bones, hardwood floors and windows that actually opened. But it sat on 4 acres of mixed pasture and woodland, with that creek cutting through the back corner and an old barn that I planned to fix up for a workshop. The previous owner, an elderly man named Frank, had kept horses there for 40 years. The fencing was solid, the well was clean, and the septic system had been updated just 2 years before. It felt like a place where I could breathe again. I'd been living there about 6 months when the Sycamore Creek Homeowners Association decided they needed to remind me I existed. I came home from work one Tuesday to find a certified letter taped to my front door. Apparently, my mailbox wasn't official enough for their communications. The letter, printed on expensive letterhead with a logo that looked like it cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, informed me that my frequent visitor was causing safety concerns among my neighbors, and that I needed to regulate guest access to maintain community standards. I read it twice before I figured out they were talking about Jake. Jake is my younger brother by 4 years, and at the time, he was going through what you might call a rough patch. His marriage had fallen apart. He'd moved out of the house he'd shared with his ex-wife for 8 years, and he was renting a depressing apartment in town while the divorce lawyers sorted through the wreckage. Most weekends, he'd drive out to my place to help me work on projects, fish in the creek, or just sit on the porch and decompress. He's quiet by nature, always has been, and after whatever he does for work all week, he seemed to crave the same kind of peace I'd moved out there to find. Sometimes he'd stay over in my guest room if we worked late on a project, or if he'd had a few beers. I never thought much of it. He's my brother, but apparently Carol Martinez thought plenty of it. Carol lived in the big colonial at the end of my road, served as the HOA president, and had the kind of energy that made you tired just watching her. She jogged past my house every morning at exactly 7:15, always slowing down to peer through my trees like she was conducting surveillance. I'd started waving just to see if I could break her focus. It never worked. According to her letter, Jake's truck, a perfectly normal Ford F-150, was frequently present at unusual hours, and my failure to notify the Association of Regular Guests was a violation of Section 4.7(3) of the Community Guidelines. The letter demanded that I submit a guest registration form for any visitor staying more than 2 consecutive days, and it reminded me that the HOA reserved the right to investigate any residents who showed patterns of concerning behavior. Laughed when I first read it, then I got angry. Then I called Jake and read him the whole thing over the phone. His response was a long pause, followed by a quiet chuckle that didn't sound entirely amused. "Interesting," he said. "What are you going to do?" I told him I was going to ignore it. These people had no authority over who I invited to my own property, and I wasn't about to start filling out paperwork to have my brother visit. Probably the right call, Jake said. "But keep that letter, and if they escalate, let me know." They escalated. 2 weeks later, another certified letter, this one informing me that my noncompliance had been noted and that I was now subject to enhanced monitoring by the HOA board. Enhanced monitoring, it turned out, meant that Carol Martinez started walking her dog past my house 3 times a day instead of just jogging by in the mornings. It meant my neighbor Tom, who'd always seemed like a decent guy, stopped making eye contact when we ran into each other at the hardware store. It meant that every time Jake's truck was in my driveway, I'd notice cars slowing down as they passed, drivers craning their necks to get a better look. The breaking point came on a Saturday in late September. Jake had driven out Friday night, after what he described as a particularly long week at work. We'd spent Saturday morning replacing the rotted boards on my back deck, and by afternoon, we were both tired and ready for a beer. We were sitting on the newly repaired deck, watching the creek and not talking much, when Carol Martinez came marching across my back pasture like she owned it. "Excuse me," she called out when she was still 50 yards away. "I need to speak with you." She was wearing workout clothes and carrying a clipboard, which somehow made the whole thing more annoying. I stood up as she approached, Jake staying seated in his chair but watching carefully. "Ma'am," I said, "you're on my property." She barely glanced at me. Her attention was focused entirely on Jake, who hadn't said a word. "I don't know who you are," she said to him, "but you've been lurking around this neighborhood for months, and we're tired of it. What's your name? What's your business here?" Jake looked at her for a long moment, then looked at me, then back at her. "I'm visiting my brother," he said quietly, "and you're trespassing." Carol's face flushed red. "This is a family neighborhood." She stopped. "We have children here. We have a right to know who's spending time in our community." She turned to me. "And you," she continued, "have been completely uncooperative with our reasonable requests for information. If you can't follow simple community guidelines, maybe you should consider whether this is the right place for you." That's when something in me shifted. Not to anger exactly, but to a cold, clear kind of focus. I've been trying to be polite, trying to ignore their harassment, trying to be the bigger person. But standing there on my own deck, listening to this woman threaten me on my own property, I realized that politeness wasn't working. "Ma'am," I said, keeping my voice level, "I need you to leave my property now." She started to argue, but Jake stood up then, all 6'2" of him, and something in his posture made her take a step back. "You heard him," Jake said, still quiet, but with an edge I recognized from our childhood. Carol looked between us, seemed to realize she was outnumbered, and turned around. But as she walked away, she called over her shoulder, "Don't think this is over. We know how to deal with troublemakers." That night, Jake and I sat on the front porch after dinner, drinking beer and listening to the cicadas. "What did she mean by that?" I asked. Jake was quiet for a long time. "People like that," he finally said, "they have their little networks, their little systems. They call each other, they call the police, they make life difficult until you give up and move away." He paused. "But sometimes their little systems have bigger problems than they realize." I asked him what he meant, but he just shrugged. "Nothing you need to worry about, but keep documenting everything. Save every letter, every interaction. And if things get weird, call me before you call anyone else." Things got weird the following Wednesday. I came home from work to find 2 county sheriff's deputies waiting in my driveway. They were polite enough, but they explained that they'd received a call about suspicious activity at my address, specifically involving a man who'd been seen casing the property and possibly conducting surveillance on other homes in the neighborhood. It took me a few minutes to realize they were talking about Jake when I explained that he was my brother and that he'd been helping me with home repairs. They seemed satisfied, but they also mentioned that this was the 3rd call they'd received about my address in the past month. "The 3rd call?" I asked. The older deputy nodded. "Someone's been reporting unusual traffic, possible drug activity, and general disturbances. We have to follow up on these things, you understand." I understood. All right. I understood that Carol Martinez and her friends were using the police as their personal harassment squad. After the deputies left, I called Jake. "They're calling the cops now," I told him. There was a long pause. "What exactly are they claiming?" he asked. I repeated what the deputies had told me, another pause. "I see," he said. "And how often have they seen me at your place?" I thought about it. Most weekends for the past couple of months. Sometimes Friday night through Sunday. Interesting, Jake said again in that same tone he'd used before. I think it's time I had a conversation with these people. That Sunday, Jake showed up earlier than usual, around 10 in the morning. He seemed more focused than normal, less relaxed. He spent most of the day taking pictures of my property lines, of the sight lines from other houses, of the road, and the creek access. When I asked him what he was doing, he said he was getting a feel for the terrain. That afternoon, Carol Martinez appeared again, this time with two other women I recognized from the neighborhood. They stood at the edge of my driveway, clearly working up the courage to approach. Finally, Carol marched up to where Jake and I were working on my fence. I've had enough, she announced. I'm calling the police right now. You people are running some kind of operation here, and we're not going to stand for it. She pulled out her phone and started dialing. Jake straightened up slowly, wiping his hands on a rag. Ma'am, he said, before you do that, maybe you and I should have a conversation. Something in his voice made her pause. What kind of conversation? She demanded. Jake reached into his back pocket and pulled out a leather wallet. He flipped it open and held it up so she could see the badge and ID card inside. Special Agent Jake Morrison, FBI, he said calmly. And I've been conducting surveillance in this neighborhood for the past 3 months, though not in the way you think. Carol's face went from red to white in about 2 seconds. The other women behind her started backing toward the road. You see, Jake continued, we've been investigating some irregularities in local municipal finances. Specifically, we've been looking into how certain HOA funds have been managed, where certain payments have gone, and how certain construction contracts have been awarded. He closed the wallet and put it back in his pocket. Your treasurer, Dennis Walsh, has been very interesting to watch. The silence that followed was the kind you feel in your chest. Carol opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. We don't, she stammered. Ma'am, Jake said, I'm going to need you to stop making these harassment calls to the sheriff's department. They're interfering with an active federal investigation, and they're creating a paper trail that's not going to look good for anyone involved. He paused. Also, I'm going to need you to stop trespassing on my brother's property and stop trying to intimidate him. He's been providing valuable assistance to our investigation, and your behavior is compromising our operational security. That's when Carol made her fatal mistake. Instead of apologizing and walking away, she got defensive. This is ridiculous, she snapped. You can't just flash a badge and expect us to believe. I'm calling the real police right now. She started. Dialing 911, Jake sighed and pulled out his phone. Agent Morrison, he said when someone answered. I need a supervisor and a local liaison at my location. We have a civilian interference situation. He rattled off my address and hung up. 20 minutes later, my driveway looked like a law enforcement convention. 2 FBI agents in suits, 3 county deputies, and a detective I didn't recognize all stood around while Jake explained the situation. Carol Martinez, who'd been growing more agitated by the minute, kept insisting that this was all some kind of scam that we were impersonating. Federal agents, that the real police needed to arrest us immediately. The FBI supervisor, a woman in her 40s, with the kind of calm authority that comes from years of dealing with difficult people, finally held up her hand. Mrs. Martinez, she said, Agent Morrison has been working this investigation for 8 months. His cover assignment to this area was approved at the bureau level, and his surveillance activities have been coordinated with local law enforcement. She gestured to the county detective. Detective Rodriguez has been our liaison throughout this operation. Carol looked at the detective, who nodded. It's true, ma'am. We've been aware of Agent Morrison's presence in the neighborhood. The supervisor continued. What we weren't aware of was the pattern of harassment calls you and other residents have been making. Calls that have required us to divert resources and have potentially compromised our investigation. The detective stepped forward. Mrs. Martinez, we're going to need you to come down to the station and answer some questions about your knowledge of Dennis Walsh's financial activities. Carol's face went from white to gray. Dennis? What about Dennis? The FBI supervisor smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. Mr. Walsh has been embezzling from your HOA for the past 2 years. He's also been taking kickbacks from construction companies and falsifying maintenance records. The money he's stolen from your neighborhood association is currently sitting in 3 different accounts in his name. She paused. Agent Morrison's surveillance has been focused on documenting these transactions and identifying any other residents who might have been involved. What followed was the most satisfying 45 minutes of my adult life. Carol Martinez, who'd spent months trying to control and intimidate me, sat in the back of a county police car answering questions about what she knew and when she knew it. The other 2 women who'd been with her slipped away at some point, probably to call their husbands and lawyers. Jake stood with his FBI colleagues, suddenly transformed from my quiet, divorced brother into a federal agent who'd been playing a role for months. And I finally understood why he'd always seemed so calm about Carol's harassment, why he'd told me to document everything, and why he'd never seemed particularly worried about her threats. The investigation, as it turned out, had been going on since spring. Dennis Walsh, the HOA treasurer, had been skimming money from the association's maintenance fund, inflating bills for landscaping and snow removal, and creating fake invoices for services that never existed. He'd stolen nearly $200,000 over 2 years, money that was supposed to go toward road repairs, drainage improvements, and community amenities. Jake's job had been to document Walsh's financial transactions, identify his methods, and gather evidence that would hold up in federal court. My property, with its clear sightlines to several key locations and its position at the end of the road, had been perfect for surveillance. Jake's weekend visits had given him cover to observe Walsh's movements, photograph his meetings with contractors, and document the flow of money through various accounts. The irony was that Carol Martinez's obsession with my suspicious brother had nearly blown an investigation that would ultimately save her neighborhood association from complete financial ruin. The aftermath was swift and thorough. Dennis Walsh was arrested on federal embezzlement charges within a week. 2 construction company owners were charged with conspiracy and fraud. The HOA board, minus Carol Martinez, who'd resigned in disgrace, hired lawyers and accountants to figure out how much money could be recovered. And suddenly, the neighborhood that had treated me like a pariah was very interested in being friendly. The apologies came in waves. First Tom, my neighbor from the hardware store, who stopped by with a bottle of bourbon and a sheepish explanation that he'd been caught up in the gossip. Then other neighbors I'd barely met, all suddenly eager to explain that they'd never really believed the rumors, that they'd always thought Carol was taking things too far, that they were sorry for any misunderstandings. I accepted their apologies politely, but I didn't forget how quickly they turned on me when it was convenient. Jake's cover was blown, obviously, but the investigation was complete. He transferred to a different field office and bought a house about an hour away, close enough that we still see each other regularly, but far enough that he can start fresh somewhere else. He seems happier now and we're settled. The divorce was finalized, his career is back on track, and he's dating someone new who actually appreciates what he does for a living. As for me, I got my quiet back. Carol Martinez moved away 6 months after the arrests, selling her house to a young couple with 2 kids who wave when I drive by and sometimes ask if they can fish in my creek. The new HOA board operates with a transparency that would have been unimaginable under the old regime. They publish detailed financial reports, hold open meetings, and generally treat residents like adults rather than suspects. Sometimes, when I'm sitting on my back deck in the evening, watching the creek and listening to the birds, I think about how close I came to giving up and moving away. Carol Martinez and her friends had made my life miserable for months, using fear and harassment and social pressure to try to drive me out. If I'd been a different kind of person, if I hadn't had Jake's quiet confidence backing me up, if I hadn't been stubborn enough to stay and fight, they might have succeeded, but they didn't know who they were dealing with. They saw a suspicious man visiting too often, staying too late, asking too many questions. They never imagined they were watching a federal agent build a case that would expose the biggest corruption scandal in their neighborhood's history. They thought they were protecting their community from outside threats. Instead, they were harassing the man who was about to save their community from the threat that was already inside. The best part is that Dennis Walsh, sitting in federal prison with a 10-year sentence for embezzlement and fraud, knows exactly how he got caught. Jake made sure to visit him before his transfer, just to explain how the investigation had worked. Apparently, Walsh had always wondered about the quiet guy who spent weekends at the house on Sycamore Creek Road, the guy who seemed to be paying attention to things that didn't concern him. Now he knows. These days, when people ask me about living in an HOA neighborhood, I tell them it's all about finding the right neighbors. The ones who respect your privacy, who don't assume the worst about strangers, and who understand that sometimes the biggest threats come from the people you trust the most. Carol Martinez never understood that. She was so busy watching the wrong person that she completely missed the real criminal living 3 streets over, stealing money from everyone. In the neighborhood, including her, I still live in the same house, still love the space and the creek and the quiet. But now when I sit on my front porch in the evening, I sometimes wait at the cars that slow down to look. Because now they're slowing down out of curiosity, not suspicion. They want to see the house where the FBI agent used to stay, the place where the whole investigation started. They wave back, and sometimes they stop to chat about fishing or weather or local politics. It's the kind of neighborhood interaction Carol Martinez always claimed to want, the kind that happens naturally when people aren't afraid of each other. Jake visits less often now, mostly holidays and special occasions. But when he does come, he parks his truck right in my driveway, stays as long as he wants, and nobody says a word about it. Because now they know exactly who he is and what he's capable of, and why crossing him was the worst mistake Carol Martinez ever made.